everybody, welcome back to some more reveals for the Great Dark Beyond. More of the neutral cards have been revealed, and they've potentially revealed one which I think might be the most meta-defining card we might get this set. Early days, I know, but it is a crazy card, and we're going to start with it. Kill Jiden. I'm really bad with names. You making them harder to pronounce, Hearthstone, or I guess WoW, doesn't really help me, but I believe it's Kill Jiden is how it's like said. 7 mana 7/7 demon, battle cry, replace your deck with an endless portal of demons. Each turn they gain an additional +2/+2. Since the dawn of Hearthstone, control players have had one big dream, and that is to make games last indefinitely. Make the game last as long as possible. Hell, even push the turn limit timer for a game of Hearthstone. That was their dream. They would put cards in their deck like Archivist Elysiana to put 10 more cards on their deck. Because if you were in a control matchup with an opponent deck that was also control, and you had 10 more cards than they did, you would win the game. Similarly, people tried to do Dead Man Hand's deck, where you would shuffle a copy of Dead Man's Hand into your deck again, which would allow you to go infinite with Dead Man's Hand, so you would literally never ever run out of a deck ever again. And the idea with your Dead Man's Hand is you'd also put cards into that hand that basically just allowed you to live until the end of time. Gain armor and control the board, for example, cards. Also, more recently, we've seen Prince Renathal, and actually Prince Renathal is now rotated back into the core set again temporarily. This card allowed you to put 40 cards into your deck instead of 30, which again, for control decks, means you have 10 more cards in the decks that didn't put Renathal in the deck. Kill Jiden makes your deck endless. You just have an endless deck. It's like Dead Man's Hand without any of the mental gymnastics you have to go through to make sure that you always have a Dead Man's Hand in your deck and you're not like shuffling garbage into your deck. Also, it's less likely to get interrupted as Dead Man's Hand might be, where, for example, maybe you overdraw a Dead Man's Hand because you ideally want to draw through your deck as quickly as possible to get this endless Dead Man's Hand combo going for that deck. Kill Jiden is just play and done. There is no hoops to jump through. You put this bad boy on the board and he destroys your deck and you have endless demons. Incredible. This card, if control decks are going to work, and I do think from cards we've seen and we're going to see, they're definitely trying to curtail these super hyper-aggressive decks with roadblocks, so to speak. If you can get to the end game and you just put a Kill Jiden on the board, and your opponent is a control deck that doesn't have this, you win. It's just that simple, you win. And moreover, it isn't just that you're getting an endless deck. That would, honestly, without the additional effect on this card, that would be probably good enough for control decks to seriously consider running it. But the demons get stronger and stronger over time, so it does lead you to this win condition. There's an inevitability that you will win the game eventually. It does potentially lead to some really scuffed races, though, in Control v Control matchups, where it's like who casts Kill Jiden first, because then you're going to get the stats faster than your opponent does. But you know what? Let's see how that works. Anyway, there are obviously decks that might want to run stuff like this. Clearly, Warlock has been designed with these big demons in hand. You could put an Archimond in your deck, you play Kill Jiden, you get a bunch of these endless demons, which by the way didn't start in your deck. You drop your Archimond eventually, and then that's a big tempo swing, a board full of demons. You could also be a bit more picky with the demons you pick out from Kill Jiden, hopefully. Maybe you don't play every single top deck one you get, you just pick and play the strongest of the demons you get. And generally speaking, demons I think are a pretty strong tribe of minions. Also, you could throw in Foreboding Flame into that deck as well. Demons that didn't start into your deck cost one less. Again, the portal, they won't be in your deck at the start of the game. Therefore, you'll get a discount on top of those demons as well. Another thing you could do is Wheel of Death, and then play Kill Jiden and Thanatom on top of this. Obviously, you play the Thanatom after your Wheel of Death, so you can just stick it into the board to protect you for a turn. Then you play Kill Jiden afterwards, and then you don't have the downside of Wheel of Death, which is you don't have a deck anymore. You have a portal instead, so you won't take fatigue damage, and you literally just have to live through those 5 turns with this army of demons in your deck. Like, it's a really, really scary process. It's a really scary scenario, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. So yeah, I fully expect to see some more Wheel of Death decks out there. I fully expect to see just control decks running this card. I expect Control Warlock to be a thing again. I mean, as I said, why would you not just put this into your Control Warrior deck? Now, obviously, I'm not saying this to put, you know, double Battlecry or Kill Jiden. Does nothing. But what I'm saying is, if you go up against a Control Warrior deck that, you know, has the usual Boom Boss type thing, this is more like the Highlander, right? But they have the Boom Boss thing. If you have Kill Jiden and they don't, you're going to win, because you'll have a deck, which means that the Boom Boss turn won't really matter. Also, actually, just in case you're wondering, this is a pretty good answer to Plagues and the TNTs as well, since it replaces your deck. They're not in your deck anymore, you can just poof them away, so very good tech card at the very least. So I expect to see a lot of decks just throwing this in there, even if it's in ETC. I also think that Control Death Knight will run this card. They are missing the inevitability of Mograine. Instead, they normally put a Plague in the deck, or Hellier into the deck more specifically, to try and get to this scenario where the game will eventually end, because your opponent will run out of cards, and you put some Plagues into their deck that then get shuffled back into the deck. So eventually they will run out of cards and will die to the Plagues. Why not just put Kil'jaeden in your deck instead? Because I'm going to tell you now, the Plagues won't work as well anymore, because if they're running Kil'jaeden, they can remove the Plagues from their deck now. But instead of killing them with Plagues, you just kill them with an endless deck instead. I've seen some other people suggesting that maybe you want to discount this card as well and play it early. I'm not sure I'm quite in that fan club right now of trying to get a really big discount on Kil'jaeden. I think most people are talking about trying to get this as a 5-mana or 4-mana minion, dropping onto the board, which is a pretty big tempo play for, you know, 5-mana 7/7. But I feel like destroying your deck that early with the demons that come out, you could low roll and potentially get some very weak turns from there. That being said, though, if you're a really hyper aggressive deck, this could go into your deck as well. Why not play like a Window Shopper Demon Hunter, for example, vomit out all the early attacking cards? And one of the weaknesses of Window Shopper decks was that once you played all your Window Shopper turns, you would run out of value and you would just lose. It was literally, can you live through Window Shopper? If you do, you win. Now you could play your Window Shoppers, and let's say on one of the minis you discover a 1-mana 1/1 Kil'jaeden, you can just drop Kil'jaeden on the board, destroy your deck, it doesn't matter, it's all detritus now, and you can sort of become a value deck instead. Like, you can just pivot from this hyper-aggressive deck into this value deck, and just try and get this to take you over the line. I honestly think this could see play in so many decks right now, so I'm looking forward to seeing what it can do. Another big card for anti-aggro, Aidar Brute, 7-mana 5/6 demon, taunt, lifesteal, costs 1 less for each enemy minion. This card is nuts, like seriously, I think this card is giga nuts. It's very similar to Rabble Bouncer, which I think was from Rastakhan's Rumble. I don't think this card saw too much play, but compared to Rabble Bouncer, which gave you 9 stats, with the same effect without lifesteal, Brute gives you 11 stats, and you get lifesteal as well, which is really crazy. Imagining on like turn 3 your opponent doing the 3 parachuting pirates play, you could drop your Aidar Brute onto the board as a 4-mana 5/6 taunt lifesteal, and that's one really big roadblock. In fact, we have some precedence of this type of thing being a roadblock. Back at the early start of the Ziliax set, there used to be a form where you would run Ticking Module with Perfect Module, bearing in mind that Ticking Module used to say that it cost 1 less for each minion in play. And the idea was that if you were a slower, maybe like mid-rangey control deck, you could put this in your deck to interrupt these hyper-aggressive token decks that swarm the board with minions. You would be able to play this Ziliax for like 3 mana, 2 or 3 mana. You could rush it as well, get some lifesteals of some 4 health, and then your opponent would have to break through this roadblock. And sometimes that would give you like an additional 12 health that lets you survive through the early aggro, get to the late game, and then just destroy all the aggro decks. They did eventually change the text on Ziliax so it doesn't do it on the enemy's board instead, so that tactic doesn't work anymore. I'd also say that old tactic was probably better than Aidar Brute because you did get some front-loaded health because Ziliax had a rush, and it had Divine Shield as well, so you got like another swing on it. But still, I think Aidar Brute, if you get into a situation where the meta is very aggressive, and you want to deal with these early pirates, for example, this is a really solid card to put into your deck. Another kind of incredible card, honestly. Ethereal Oracle, 3 mana, 2/3 neutral minion. Spell damage +1, spell burst, draw 2 spells. Kind of crazy. It's super, super rare for cards that have spell damage on the text to have an additional positive effect on it. The closest I can think to this is Blood Mage Thalnos, which is like one of the classic legendary minions, I guess, or at least one of the classic cheap legendary minions that sometimes sneaks into decks even nowadays. The spell damage +1 is nice, helps you smoke your opponent's face down with pew spells, and also, just in case, you know, you're not ready for that combo turn yet, you can just play it early as a 2 mana 1/1 draw a card, and that is an acceptable level of effect. I kind of see Ethereal Oracle as a similar thing. You could save it a little bit later on for the spell damage. You could also use this as part of a intermediate bit of a combo where you put your Ethereal Oracle, you fire off one of the spells, you spell burst it, draws 2 more spells that do more spell damage, and then you pew them off as well with more spell damage from the Ethereal Oracle. Like, this is pretty spooky as the card goes. Where I'm kind of imagining this sees a little bit of play is with like Mr. Vista Druid Mage decks, where obviously during the turns after you've played like Mr. Vista, you want to play as many spells as you can because Mr. Vista will recast them. If you Mr. Vista into Ethereal Oracle into cast a spell, you draw 2 more spells that can then go into the Mr. Vista series of spells. You're also getting spell damage on top of that, so you're just peppering more and more damage. Like, it's a seriously pretty spooky combo. I'd also say that obviously 2/3 stat line is understated for 3. It's more like a 2 mana stat line. But the difference between stats between Ethereal Oracle and what you'd expect it to be versus Thalnos, I think it's a better deal on the Oracle. The real difficulty is just going to be getting the spell burst effect off, but that probably means you want to be casting some cheap spells. Fortunately, there's a lot of good cheap spells in Hearthstone right now, so I can see a world where Ethereal Oracle sees some play in some of the decks out there. We also have Crystal Welder, 2 mana 2/3, Taunt. Battlecry, if you're building a starship, gain +2/+2. Alright, when I saw this at first, I was like, holy shit, this is the nuts. If you can have a starship on the board before you play this minion, it is a 2 mana 4/5 with Taunt. That's pretty good. That would probably see play in Standard, I think. But when you actually start to think about it a little bit more, it actually probably won't be as good as we're hoping it's going to be. We haven't seen a starship piece yet that costs less than 3, I think. And this is sort of the problem of this card. I suspect there won't be a starship piece that costs 1 mana because of the existence of this card. Maybe there'll be a 2 cost, but I don't think there'll be a 1 cost. In which case, you're not going to ever be curving this on 2. You're probably going to, at the fastest, be playing this on 4 instead. And at turn 4, I know it's still 2 mana 4/5. It's a big bump, but I think it's going to end up just being a little bit too fair, so to speak. You'll have to weave in another 2 mana play on top of that, because if you just do 2 mana 4/5 for 4, you've effectively paid 4 mana, right, if you don't do anything with the other 2 mana. So I just don't quite see a world where this sees play. And honestly, the way I kind of see this card is something like the Mana Thirst cards, where they had pretty weak stat lines, but then if you could play them later on in the game, it would bump up the stat line to be better than it otherwise was. Cheating mana, so to speak, gets worse as the game goes on, because you have more ways to deal with the cheat. Crystal Welder, I think if you can play this on 4, with another 2 mana minion, it's actually a really solid play. It's a very big bump, it's hard to deal with. I think if you're playing it like any other turn other than that, or if you don't weave in a full spending of mana on the turn you play it, it just becomes a little bit too weak. Also, we're going to have to see the full Starship repertoire. We still haven't seen that yet. Maybe it makes those decks just as like a protective barrier while you're building your Starship, but I think it's going to end up being pack filler. A card I don't think will be pack filler, Astral Vigilant, 1 mana 1/1 minion. Battlecry, get a copy of the last Draai you played. Okay, this is kind of like Tidepool Pupil, and Tidepool Pupil got nerfed. This used to be, was it 1 mana 1/1 Tidepool Pupil? It used to be 1 mana anyway. If you cast 3 spells while you're holding this, you could discover one of them. It's a little bit more flexible than getting a copy of the last thing you played. It does mean that Tidepool took a little bit more setting up than Astral Vigilant will do. So there's like positives and negatives for both. One of the big positives though is a huge difference between a 1 mana card and a 2 mana card. It is literally twice the mana to play here at a 2 mana cost. Just 1 mana means it's so much easier to weave it into a play, especially as you get into the later game. And you're probably going to be playing this later into the game to copy a really big Draai. For example, Velen. Now, I did see a lot of people saying, oh, if you play Astral Vigilant with Velen, you'll get Velen back again because Astral Vigilant is a Draai. It is not a Draai. Astral Vigilant, even though it has Draai in the card text, isn't of the tribe, so you won't get, like, endlessly recurring Velens. Nevertheless, you play Velen on turn 7 for, like, tempo, because I'm currently seeing this Draai deck being very tempo-orientated. Then on turn 8, you start with an Astral Vigilant and play Velen again. That's pretty good, right? And I assume... No, Velen won't cast Velen's effect, so that won't work, but I just assume that's going to be a big enough value bump that it's going to be pretty scary to deal with. So I see Astral Vigilant seeing play. We've still not seen the full Draai package, especially within the classes, but I'm beginning to piece together the bits of the puzzles and seeing a pretty strong deck out there. We also saw some more Draai. Astrobiologist, 2 mana 2/2, Battlecry, at the start of your next turn, discover a spell. I think this card is pretty weak. I think this is almost like a arena type card. We have seen cards where it's, you know, like understated minion that discovers a card, for example, like Vulpera Scoundrel. And sometimes these cards did, especially on free-to-play decks, make like the 30th card cut of these decks. But generally speaking, we're a bit too weak. Now, I will say Astrobiologist is less understated than Vulpera Scoundrel was, for example, and a lot of the other cards that say Discover AX. That being said, you got it up front, you got it as a really fast effect on the discovery, whereas Astrobiologist, you have to wait for a turn afterwards. So I think there's a little bit of like loss of value in doing that. So I kind of see Astrobiologist in that similar tier. The only reason this would see, I think, any play is if there's really like a dearth of 2 mana Draenei that are good. I don't think there will be, so I don't think Astrobiologist will see any play. Another card that I think might see some play though is Crimson Commander, 3 mana 4/3 Draenei. Battlecry and Death Rattle give all Draenei in your hand +1/+1. Wow, this card is potentially the bee's knees if you're building some sort of hand buff deck. It actually reminds me a little bit of the Painter's Virtue, one of the key cards in hand buff Paladin. Painter's Virtue up front gives you +1/+1 hand buff, and promising you in the future another +1/+1, and then another +1/+1 on top of that. So Virtue can go higher than Crimson Commander could. However, Crimson Commander does come up front with a 4/3 stat line, and it's 1 mana cheaper as well. I think overall the Painter's Virtue is better, by the way, because there's more ways to interact with minions than there are with weapons, but I still think it's a pretty solid card. If you're actually looking for a minion comparison, it's pretty close to Glowstone Technician. Glowstone Technician was severely understated. It was more like a 3 mana stat line on the minion to give you effect of Battlecry. Give all minions +2/+2 in your hand. Now that was all front loaded, whereas Crimson Commander is Battlecry and Death Rattle. However, a 3 mana 4/3 is not a big tempo loss. That's a pretty acceptable stat line for a minion. So if there is a tempo Draenei deck that is very minion based, and I think there will be based on the cards we've seen so far, I see this definitely making that list. And a bit like Elemental Shaman, it's kind of where I'm putting them together with one another right now. It's pretty unlikely you're going to run many other tribes than Draenei or anything that doesn't have a tribe. You can normally make that deck be just elementals. I kind of see the same thing as the Draenei, so the restriction of it being Draenei only, I think is very minor. I think it's sort of irrelevant. I almost see this as just 3 mana 4/3 give minions in your hand +1/+1, and then maybe you get another +1/+1 on top of that if you can get the Death Rattle, which at turn 3, there's probably not a lot of ways to deal with this. Obviously, anything with the Death Rattle has a liability to being silenced. There's not a lot of silence in Hearthstone right now. They also have a liability to be stolen. There is a decent amount of stealing in Hearthstone, but you're probably not going to get that at turn 3, so I think this is a very, very solid card. We just need to see some of the class Draenei to figure out where it's going to go. We also got 5 mana 6/4 Draenei, Lunar Trailblazer. Battlecry, set the cost of a random spell in your hand to this minion's cost. Wow, we finally have a way to discount Tsunami and Sunset Volley. No, kind of weird. It seems very, very different to some of the other Draenei we've seen so far, which seem to be a bit more like tempo orientated. Like you play a Draai, next turn you play another Draai, it gets like an additional effect, so to speak. We haven't seen too many that are related to spells. Maybe this is a hint to the other thing this tribe is going to be doing. Messing about with spell costs or something, or when you cast spells, something happens with them. The clear intention of this card is to cheat a big spell, hit like your Tsunami with your Lunar Trailblazer, and reduce it from a 10 mana spell to a 5 mana spell. Now, it is a random spell, not like the highest cost spell or the lowest cost spell, so you're probably going to have to run a bastardized deck in some way that doesn't have many cheap spells. Otherwise, you're going to raise the cost to 5, which is not ideal. So currently, I can only see this card seeing play in Big Spell Mage. Fully enough, in terms of cards it reminds me of, it does remind me a little bit of Belinda Stonehearth, which was an insane card in the old Big Spell Mage deck. Now, obviously, I think Lunar Trailblazer is worse by the fact that it doesn't draw 2 spells, which was one of the big things about Belinda, was that she drew the spell she was going to discount. But they're both cards that could give you more of a discount if you reduce the stats on Belinda Stonehearth or the mana cost of Lunar Trailblazer. Normally, it's easier for you to lower your own mana cost on minions than your own stats of your own minions. So in a sense, Lunar is easier to get a bigger discount than Belinda, but Belinda with the draw was just way, way, way better. Also, it swapped the stats so Belinda became an unbelievably overstatted minion, so I'm not saying, you know, it's super comparable to Belinda, but there is some, like, inklings about it where, okay, I can see you doing similar things with this card. Unfortunately, other than Big Spell Mage, I actually just don't see a world where this card sees any other play. I thought maybe Control Warlock might say it. Really, it's only Mage and Warlock, the classes that have ginormous spells right now. So maybe this makes your Big Spell Mage list. I'm not convinced it will do, because in that deck you want coins and big spells, in which case you can't put Lunar Trailblazer into that deck. I just think what they already have right now in Mage is just better than what this card offers. But Warlock can't do that, so maybe you put it in some sort of Control Warlock deck. You try and reduce your Wheel of Death a little bit, and maybe play the Wheel of Death early when your opponent is going to struggle more to deal with the minions you can get from that, like Thanatem, for example. But I think this is a bit too much of a pipe dream. Now, you are right, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, if you reduce the mana cost of this card, you can get a bigger mana discount. But there's not that many great ways to discount minions right now. Maybe the Draai will include a card that helps you do this. You could put this into Paladin with Service Ace, for example, and just hope that you hit the Trailblazer. You could also use Twilight Medium. There are ways for Priests to put cards on top of their deck. And if you Twilight Medium the Lunar Trailblazer, it turns into a 1 mana card, in which case you're getting a pretty big discount on almost any spell. As long as the spell isn't 1 mana or 0 mana, you're getting a discount. But I think that's just too many hoops to jump through for too little reward. Also, another Draai, 7 mana 3/9, Galactic Crusader, Taunt. Death Rattle, get 2 random holy spells. They cost 3 less. Interesting card, kind of reminds me a little bit of Flame Behemoth. Both these minions are understated. For 7 mana on Galactic Crusader, you're getting 12 stats. For 6 on Flame Behemoth, you're getting 9 stats. I'd probably say Galactic Crusader is very slightly better statted, just even because of the fact it has Taunt and it has a lot of health. So it is somewhat of a roadblock, but it's pretty late for the roadblock to come up since it's a 7 mana minion. Also, Flame Behemoth on the flip side gave you the value up front, whereas Galactic Crusader is downstream, so to speak. You're going to have to wait for a Death Rattle versus getting the Battle Cry, but you do get a bigger discount on the minion. I just don't see this card really seeing any play. 2 random holy spells. The holy spell pool is basically say get 2 random spells from Paladin or Priest, right? Because that's the only classes that currently have holy spells. I think these just gain random value cards, especially random cards. They're just too random, right? And I got to thinking about this, and I was like, you know what? Narain Sooth Fancy sees no play in Priest right now, which gives you 2 copies of cards that are in your deck. I know they change over time, but they're in your deck, which implies that they're good. This is an understated minion that gives you 2 cards, so to speak. This card sees 0 play. I just don't see a world where Galactic Crusader sees any play. Also worth mentioning, if you want to do the maths on this, because you do get a 3 mana discount, the average holy spell cost is about 3.19 for recurring. But a lot of these spells actually do cost less than 3, so on average you are expecting to get the full 3 mana discount on the 2 spells, but in the real world, if you take like the most common outcomes, I think you're going to be hitting like 2 mana spells often and not getting the full discount. Also, a lot of the holy spells are pretty pretty average. We've seen from the Draai so far, and I kind of alluded to this before as well, many of them are tempo-orientated plays. Playing a 7-mana 3/9 taunt isn't a particularly tempo-orientated play, and a lot of those holy spells are more control-orientated. So I think this is a direction for the tribe that is separate from this tempo deck. We haven't seen the full picture yet, so maybe there is a world that you want to play this. I'm not sure about it. In terms of holy spells, if you are trying to play this in a tempo deck, you could try and get the Crusader Aura, which would be pretty nice to get. You could also get something like Creation Protocol and try and copy Velen again. The other nice thing about this card, potentially, but I think again it's too slow, if you're playing some sort of spell school deck, this isn't a way for your class to access holy spells, but it's such a slow way to get them, I just don't think you would use Galactic Crusader to do it. Okay, now we get to a card that I actually really don't know how to evaluate it. Deep Space Curator, 3 mana 2/4, Spell Burst, get a random minion of the spell's cost, set it to 0. I really struggle to evaluate this card. So obviously it's understated, you're getting 6 stats for 3 mana, that's not good enough in modern Hearthstone. It also comes with like a hoop that you sort of have to jump through, because if you don't Spell Burst the card, then it's pointless. Which kind of implies that you're not going to ever curve this out on 3, you're going to have to wait for like 5, 6, 7 to play this card. This is where things get a little bit confusing though with it, because it's really how do you evaluate the discount you get on the spell burst effect versus casting another spell onto it. And that is where I struggled. The closest card I ended up coming to like the conclusion of for this was Tortolan Forager, which was more of an arena card really than a standard card when it was, in the set. This was a 2 mana 2/2 that had a battle cry of adding a random minion with 5 more attack to your hand. So it didn't have any hoops to jump through. But it did give you a random minion. Now, it was a random minion within a very finer pool, but it was random at the end of the day. And it also went to your hand and not onto the board. Deep Space Curator, you're getting a random minion, but it's within the pool of the spell's cost. Now, obviously it's going to be hard, or it's going to be inconsistent to spell burst anything that is 8 or more mana unless you're a druid, because you're probably going to have this minion killed. It's not going to live on the board for another turn. In which case you're looking at casting a spell between 0 and 7 mana and reducing its cost to 0, which is pretty big on the 7 mana spells. But is it? I mean, it just depends on what a random minion value is. I typically value it pretty weak. It's definitely worse than discovering or finding a card from your deck. A lot of random minions in Hearthstone have battle cries. Battle cries normally mean that the minions are understated. Now, obviously, you can get the battle cry of this card because it goes into your hand, not onto the board, which is like an upside, so to speak, but it might be a battle cry that just doesn't synergize with your deck. And there is a lot of like strong synergies in Hearthstone right now, not a lot of just strong on their own right cards. So I think Deep Space Curator is going to just be too slow, too random. Occasionally you'll get like a super high roll with this, but more often than not, I think you're going to get a pretty weak roll. I think when I value this card is, I think this is a card you won't ever put into your deck, but if you're generated this card, you wouldn't be super upset about it, so it's reasonable. I think this could be a pretty good arena card to some degree. Assuming, obviously, you're in a class in arena that generates a spell at some point during the game. Also, interesting card, Starscale Contella, 5 mana 4/7 dragon, spell burst, double this minion's attack. Wow, that's a lot of stats, potentially, if you can cast a cheap spell with it. Obviously cut from a very similar cloth to Scaled Nightmare. This minion's attack doubled at the start of each of your turns, so the idea was that you would try to keep it alive for multiple turns until it turns into like some absolute monster red dragon and just smokes your opponent's face down in one turn. Starscale Constella hasn't got the higher ceiling of Scaled Nightmare, however it has got way more pro activity inbuilt into the card. Since you don't have to wait for a turn to happen, you can just cast a spell to get the doubling of the attack. If you do 5 mana and you play a 1-cost spell, you're kind of looking at this as a 6 mana 8/7, which is actually a pretty good stat line, so I do see worlds where this is going to see some play, especially when you consider you get more bang for your buck if you buff this card. So, for example, you could put this into some sort of Dragon Druid deck with Take to the Skies, you draw your Starscale Constella, turn it into a 5/8, and then you spell burst it. Oh, well, you eventually will spell burst it, and you'll turn it into a 5 mana 10/7, which is really, really good, very, very threatening. You might want to put this into a Nexus Prince Shafar deck, which I kind of implied would be some sort of hand buff deck that didn't go wide compared to hand buff Paladin, but would go taller. And there aren't many minions taller than this Starscale Contella. If you can start, like, doing these, like, muscles and stuff like that, the Cup of Muscles, and your Nexus Prince Shafar's getting onto this card, you could quite easily see a world where you play a 1-mana spell on this, and you just suddenly turn it into, like, a 16-8 minion or a 16-10 minion. And that is going to be pretty spooky. The real question is whether or not you're going to do this early enough for it to really matter. Obviously, if you're playing this card, like, at turns 8, 9, 10 as a big boy, sure, some decks won't be able to deal with it, but other decks will be able to comfortably deal with just a big minion with no other effects. So, I see a world where people will test this card. I definitely see the meme potential on it, but I'm not sure if it's going to be hugely game-changing. But it's an interesting card nonetheless. Finally, we get to Astral Vigilant, 3-mana 5/1 demon. Lifesteal, spell burst, attack a random enemy minion. A pretty weak card, definitely just pack filler. I sort of see this as 4-ish mana, deal 5 lifesteal damage, which is kind of what it is, and it's only to a minion, and it's to a random minion. For 4 mana, you cast Death Strike in Death Knight. This is a card that doesn't see play. Well, it does see a bit of play, but doesn't see it play in a lot of decks. It's really just the control deck that sometimes runs it. It's like a 30th card in that deck, which is 6 lifesteal to a minion for 4. Assuming you're casting a spell that costs 1 mana, it means that Astral Vigilant is more random than Death Strike and is worse by the stat line. There are things you can do to it to buff the demon or protect the demon in some way, but it's simply hoops are just not worth jumping through. So I think this card is just going to be pure pack filler. Anyway, that'll do it for the second part of the neutrals. I think there's still some neutrals to come down the line. Don't quote me on this one, but I think there are. We are going to start seeing some class cards, though, going forward. I believe Priest is up first, so I look forward to them in the next episode. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like and subscribe. Everything helps me out, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!